Psychedelic Spotlight podcast. I am your host, David Flores, CEO of Psychedelic Spotlight, and I'm delighted to be joined here today by Dr. Mike Raymont. He is the CEO of Albert Labs, a laboratory-based clinical research and drug development enterprise focused on improving patient access to psychedelic-assisted therapies through accelerated regulatory approval pathways. Now, with that, Dr. Mike, it is a pleasure to have you here with us. How are you doing?
Very well, thanks. A mic is good enough. No doctor is necessary.
All right, perfect. Thank you. I appreciate that. So Mike, it is. So with that, Mike, I want to use this as an opportunity. I know the company is currently preparing for its listing on the Canadian Securities Exchange. And so I'd love to take this as an opportunity to further introduce the company to the growing community of investors here in the psychedelics space. There's obviously a lot going on in this space right now. Very exciting time. So if you wouldn't mind, starting by just telling us a little bit about Albert Labs, who the company is, and maybe highlight a couple of key items here that you believe are helping to separate Albert Labs from some of the competitors in the space right now.
Thank you, David. Well, listen, let me start by saying, unfortunately, we're all aware there's a huge problem out there with mental health. And this problem's only getting worse by the day. Partly it's being because we now appreciate mental health as a real issue, not it's all in your head, tough it out, guys. But it's real, and people are suffering all over the world, from whether it's anxiety, depression, PSTD, all these kinds of things. These are just terribly afflicting diseases, and we have to call them diseases that are impacting people's enjoyment of life, their ability to do their job, their families, and it's costing the world a lot in economic costs too, because they're just less able to perform. So if there's a problem, there's an opportunity, and the opportunity is to use new types of drugs. And in particular, what we'll talk about is psychedelic drugs, and we're commercializing one based on psilocybin, probably well known to many of your viewers. But here's where I'm going to make some perhaps audacious statements. We've really carefully crafted our strategies, and we think we're going to be first to market with a regulated drug. And that means by the end of 22, if we're not quite so lucky and slip a little in our timetable, it might be 23. But we think we're going to have an approved drug by the regulators by the end of 22, and by 23, 24, we're going to be profitable. And I much appreciate having competitors in this field because it legitimizes it. If we didn't have competitors, why would investors be interested at all? Well, of course we have competitors, but we think we've got some real differentiations. And those are two I'm going to throw out there to start with. And, let's see if we can explore them in a little more detail.
Yeah, most definitely. Now, saying you're going to be profitable, obviously that is a very encouraging statement that of course requires creating a path to profitability. And I think what ties into that is the structure of a company and how a company is operating. And I know a key component to this is the asset light business model that the company has currently utilized here so far. So do you want to maybe share a little bit more about that approach and how you believe it is helping to create the structure to help benefit the company?
Sure. And I'm going to add to asset light, it's also about speed to market. Those are our two overarching strategies. So speed to market, and why I'm making this audacious claim that we're going to be first in the market with a regulated drug, is because we're using a different pathway for regulatory approval. And this is being pioneered primarily in the UK. But I want to emphasize to your viewers, to the audience, that it is no less rigorous than the conventional approach they're all used to, which is called randomized controlled trials. So, the things that have been used for medicines for many years. But there are some very specific reasons why Albert Labs' particular formulations and particular strategy can use this real world evidence approach. And instead of 5 to 10 years or more, we're talking about 1 to 3 years, and in our case, even less than that to get regulatory approval. But it is exactly the same approval as you would get through a randomized controlled trial. And it is absolutely proven that these medicines are going to be safe. They won't let us on the market unless they're safe and efficacious. So these trials, because of course they last a shorter period of time, inevitably they're cheaper to some extent.
Right.
Here's the reason why they're different. Because real world evidence trials are dealing with real patients in hospital settings, and that we collect data right there and then on the fly, and we can, in a sense, skip phases 1 in a typical traditional clinical trial and phase 2A. Why? Because the compound we're using has already got proven scientific data behind it to show that it's generally safe and generally efficacious for the indication we're going after.
That is incredibly fascinating. And I want to make sure that we certainly drive that home with viewers out there. So it is the strategy of utilizing real world evidence that is, in a sense, going to help accelerate the process here for Albert Labs. I just want to make sure that that's very, very crystal clear. Is that what we're looking at here?
Absolutely. And there's another component to this too. We're going after what might be regarded as a focused, at least, if not narrow indication, a narrow part of mental disorders to begin with. And that's specifically anxiety in cancer patients. Now, it isn't a small market, and we can talk about market size and how we progress onto markets in a moment. But we've chosen this purposely because, again, it fits the RWE, real world evidence approval model, because it's an urgent and unmet need. There's nothing really that Big Pharma has in its arsenal, or the physicians have, oncologists have, to counteract anxiety in cancer patients. And you can imagine what it's like, not only a diagnosis of cancer, but the anxiety that goes along with that as well. And in fact, anxiety actually damages the immune system. The additional stress makes you weaker to respond to the cancer, and it makes the cancer treatments less effective. So this is why it's an excellent indication. It's one that regulators say is what's called an urgent and unmet need.
Yeah.
And it allows us to use this pathway because we've already shown that what we're doing is using something that's safe and efficacious.
Yeah, I love it. I mean, I think that is brilliant. So thank you again for kind of reiterating all of that, because I think it's something very important for folks out there to understand that that is the pathway that the company is taking. And I think it's wonderfully strategic. So really great to hear about that. I also want to talk a little about some of these strategies in terms of scaling here for the company. I know the primary focus, at least initially, is to scale throughout the UK and Europe. Do you want to talk a little bit about those strategies? And are there any potential thoughts about scaling into the United States at any point?
Indeed, there are. But let me say one other thing about scaling. I mentioned that initially we're going after this cancer-related anxiety indication. But you see, once you have an approved drug, a regulated drug that's been approved by the regulators, physicians at their discretion can use it for other conditions. They don't have to, in other words, once we have approval for cancer-related anxiety, this drug can be used by physicians to treat patients with, for example, depression for other reasons, or other anxieties caused by other things. Addiction, PTSD, yes.
You got it.
And other such mental conditions. So in a sense, physicians become our sales force. As a company, we wouldn't actually be able to go out and make claims about other applications of the drug to other conditions. But physicians, they're almost duty bound by their ethical code that if they think this can help a patient, they can use it on what's called an off-label use. In the US, in Europe, it's more commonly known as off-license use. And so this enables us to go from, and here's some frightening numbers, a market in the UK of about a million sufferers to as many as 11 million in the EU and an additional 5 million in North America. So you talk about pathways to those geographic markets, absolutely. Because again, for specific indications, for specific diseases, there are agreements between regulators in different countries to give an accelerated pathway to drugs that solve these problems that are so urgent and not dealt with effectively by anything else. So the regulatory process we'll use in the UK is recognized by the EU. And indeed, our chief medical officer wrote some of the protocols, the very protocols that we're going to use. He worked for both the UK regulator as well as a long history in big pharma, but he actually worked for the regulator in the US, the MHRA, in the UK, and also for the EU regulator as well. One other thing to add is that, again, a reason why we chose cancer-related anxiety is because cancer drugs can be accelerated into the US market through a partnership between regulators and the FDA called Project Orbis. Now, that also includes Japan, Australia, the EU, as I mentioned, and the UK and the US, and I've maybe left out a country or two, but it really opens up these markets quickly for us. So yes, we're very comfortable with our, we feel, unique strategies that not only get us to the market sooner, get us to profitability sooner, and therefore returns to shareholders. I mean, this is what it's all about, really. This is what your viewers are interested in. Yes, I know we all feel good. And honestly, the reason, hey, it's not for me come to work, it's come back to work. Listen, I'm sure viewers realize by now, I'm not a young guy. I've had a 45-year career in private equity, in leading healthcare, tech companies, and so on. And one of them used this very strategy with a narrow market start, broadening out into other markets because the physicians loved the product. So that's been my history. For my sins, I was also a deputy minister in the Canadian government, but I wasn't cut out to be a bureaucrat. But the role was as president of the National Research Council. Now, in that role, I saw hundreds, if not thousands, of companies, because that's the biggest provider of R&D for the government, but it's also a commercialization entity, funding a lot of commercialization in joint ventures and so on with the private sector. So, I mean, I'll tell you, I was essentially retired. And I came back to do this because I feel it's so important to help people's lives. But ultimately, that's what brings me back to work. And that's a lot of what drives our team. But ultimately, for viewers, it's about making a buck.
Yeah.
And let's get to the point here. Making a buck is what we're going to do for them because we'll be in the market faster and we have lower risk. Because you see, there's one other thing about our strategy that I forgot to mention, which is important. Because our target condition is very focused, cancer-related anxiety, then what are called the endpoints? That means the proof we have to provide to the regulator to get approval is actually very specific and quite narrow to the indication. So we have really only a few conditions to meet. Whereas if I say to the regulator, oh, we're going to solve all depression and anxiety problems, they're going to say, well, yeah, you have to do that for every different patient population out there suffering every condition that relates to anxiety and depression. Virtually impossible to prove. So, I mean, sorry to be a little long-winded there, but I hope it shows how our strategies unite together in this overarching way of speed to market and how we're very confident that we can get there. This isn't, we're not sitting in a coffee shop scribbling things on the back of an envelope. This is very real. We've taken 2 years to determine this strategy, and we've already got 20, 30 employees. We've got PhD microbiologists, we've got everything ready to go. We are waiting to press the button on our clinical trial in Q1, Q2 of 22, and to have results before the end of 22 and reimbursement before the end of 22.
That's fantastic. And I mean, I think it's a laser focused strategy. And I think that to me is what stands out more than anything else. You hinted a little bit about what's coming here in early 2022. And that's kind of what I wanted to talk a little bit about right now, seeing how we're at the very end of 2021. I know the listing on the CSE is forthcoming. Are there plans for any additional listings? Is that anything that you, of course, only share what you're able to hear, but can you maybe give us a little bit more insight in terms of what lies ahead here going into 2022 for the company?
Absolutely, I can. Yes. Look, we chose the CSE, the Canadian Stock Exchange, because we're originally a Canadian company. These are a team of people, for the most part, that I've worked with before. I happen to live in Vancouver Island for my summers anyway. As I say, I'm currently sitting in Portugal, partly because we have operations there and I'm doing some work when I'm over here, also enjoying the odd game of golf.
Nice.
But yes, the CSE listing was obvious for us to go with right from the start as our first listing. And we have had conditional approval for actually a month or more now. The only reason we didn't list before Christmas is simply because we just don't feel that before Christmas is a good time to launch onto the market. So we're waiting until probably the January of 2022 before we actually pay our fees and list on the CSE. After that, yes, stay tuned, because absolutely, it's very relevant, because we're doing most of our work in England and Europe, that we be registered on a stock market here. And we also want to provide the opportunity for, again, people like your audience to be able to invest and buy our stock and share our success with us. So we're going for OTC as fast as we can, as soon as we finish our CSE listing. And then we're working with a superb bank here in London, not right where I am, but in London, who are very well recognized in the cannabis space. And I'm going to be very modest here. They tell us they've looked at 50 different odd companies in the psychedelic space, and we're the first one they've chosen to back. And so this is Crystal Capital, maybe known to you and your viewers, but Crystal Capital is going to help us with advice on exactly which exchange in Europe, London almost certainly, to list on, so that we give maximum exposure to shareholders in Europe, in the European market.
Yeah, I love the methodical approach to the process that you guys are taking here. You're taking things step by step rather than trying to just jump into everything. And that to me is so unique, I think, because right now with so much happening in this space, it seems like it's almost a rat race at times. Everyone's trying to just push themselves to the front of the line. And in the long term, that may not be advantageous. So I really do appreciate the approach that you guys have taken here so far. And Mike, before we put a bow on the conversation here, I want to circle back to something that you mentioned earlier, and it's something that I usually like to end conversations like this with, and that is what inspires you the most to be doing what you're doing. You said this essentially brought you out of retirement, so I have to imagine that there was a moment of inspiration or something that you saw here. There's also something you said earlier about where there's a problem, there's an opportunity, and that really resonated with me. I love that. But what motivates you? What when you wake up in the morning, what are you passionate about in terms of being involved here with Albert Labs?
Well, David, that's a terrific question. And I'm glad to have the opportunity to sort of share a slightly personal aspect of this with your viewers, because I've actually done this, been there before with another healthcare company. As I mentioned, we used the same sort of strategy. We got FDA approval as it happened. We didn't use RWE. It wasn't known in those days, but we got FDA approval for a narrow indication. And it was for an advanced wound dressing for burn wounds. And there's nothing more tragic to me at that time than when you walk into the worst of all was a kid's burn wound unit. Can you imagine walking into a unit where there are all these kids suffering from burns? It was traumatic to me, and maybe I'm suffering PTSD.
Yeah.
PTSD because of that. But no, the thing was that I was immensely inspired, at the same time as almost horrified. I was inspired by that this was something that I got to do. I got to get up in the morning. But you know what? Let's not forget again the fact that I'm also, and not just the back of my mind, but the forefront of my mind, saying, but you can make a buck on this as well. And so can those who are your stakeholders, your shareholders. Yeah. So our stakeholders are not just shareholders, and they're not just patients. They're both. And I think that the same is true of this, because, I've come to realize I was probably one of these people. I was one of these people 10 years ago who used to say, mental health, it's just because people aren't tough enough. But it's not true. And I think viewers will really appreciate that. And I'll tell you why and how. Because of things like this. right? All the time. I mean, I've got two of them here, right? And they're ringing and I'm getting messages and this will expect me to respond. And then my computer does this or that, the next thing. And then it all goes wrong because technology isn't reliable. So talk about stress these days. It's not the stress of being chased by the lion, but it's an even worse and insidious stress. And that's the stress of being bombarded by constant messages and decisions that we have to make. And we multitask, and let's face it, we might think we're good at multitasking, but none of us are all that good. So we rush around and we never do any job completely that well. And these all bring on mental disorders like stress, caused ultimately by stress, some other factors as well, such as the unrest and the awful disparities in the world. So look, yes, in a sense, you can call me a do-gooder. That makes me feel good to do that. But I'm also a very realistic businessman, and we're going to make a buck at this, and so are our shareholders. But that's what gets me up in the morning.
I love it. It's a very clear strategy, and I think that's what's more important than anything else here. Mike, I got to say, I really enjoyed this conversation. I'm more intrigued than ever before about Albert Labs, and I look forward to continuing to follow the progress here of the company. It sounds like you guys have a lot of really exciting things lined up here. And again, I just go back to how you are rolling it out, doing it the right way. So I'm really excited to continue to follow the progress here. We will make sure we get the website for Albert Labs tied into this podcast here. But is there anything else that you want to add before we sign off here?
There's one analogy. Your viewers will probably be familiar, as you will be, with a company called GW Pharma in cannabis. Now, they did virtually the same thing in cannabis that we're promising to do in psychedelics. And that is, they took a narrow indication and they used a cannabis extract to go after epilepsy. They got approval for epilepsy, albeit not by the same route, a somewhat slower route than us, but they got approval. And then guess what? Doctors found, physicians found they could use this drug for other things, and the company sold for $7.2 billion with one drug approved. So we've got others in the pipeline. As I say, stay tuned. We've got lots up our sleeve. And yes, we do think we've got this strategy nailed. So thank you for the opportunity to talk to you. And it's been a delight. I hope we have a chance to do it again in the not too distant future.
Oh, we'll definitely get that set up. Thank you again, Mike. I appreciate it.